In this video, I'm going to talk about the Hydra. This is a metaphor that I created a couple years ago when I was asked to talk about the various privileging forces that exist within the humanitarian sector, but also within the larger world. When I first came up with the idea, I had an artist friend draw a Hydra, and I had him draw various heads on the Hydra. In the first version of the Hydra, it only had 5 heads, but as I thought more deeply about the Hydra and got feedback from generations of students who looked at the Hydra, I've added 3 more heads. And we'll talk about each of these heads in detail. As you can see, the body of the Hydra is made up of privileging forces. Privileging forces are fueled by toxic othering. We have discussed this phenomena for many weeks now. And so the key to understanding the Hydra and then taming the Hydra is understanding this toxic othering and how it leads to privileging forces. Another key to understanding and taming the Hydra is understanding that all of the heads of the Hydra have the same body. That is, they have the same basic mechanism. They have the same process behind them. And so, although racial differences and ethnic differences might be different from differences between men and women and the struggles between different groups and different genders, the mechanism behind the othering is the same. And it can turn into toxic othering when there's a disparity of power. In order to understand and tame the Hydra, we have to take the long view. We have to look at history going back not just tens of years, but hundreds and even thousands of years. And in order to have a vision of the future, we need to look in terms of our own lifetimes and generations beyond us. Similarly, we need to take the long view in terms of geography. We can't just think locally and within our own personal circle. We have to think globally as well. We have to interconnect our understanding of our worlds with the larger world. And so understanding and taming the Hydra is using the sociological imagination to think it more broadly in all kinds of ways. The Hydra can be tamed, but it will take efforts from us all. The basic premise of the Hydra is that all of the various privileging forces that are represented by the heads on the Hydra are all rooted in the toxic othering process that we have talked about through our term. We talked about the idea of ethnocentrism and how looking at another culture only through the lens of your own culture will lead you to see your culture as being superior. Ethnocentrism is something that aid workers and humanitarians and sociologists want to warn against. It's a natural tendency, but being ethnocentric can lead to being racist as well. Connected to ethnocentrism is the idea of various statuses and ascribed statuses. Statuses just given to you by society. And so most of our statuses, most of our way of being in the world are things that we didn't choose. They just came with us as we lived our life. My example is my skin color, my sexuality, and my gender. Those are things which came with with being born. I was born in the United States, so that's an ascribed status. I didn't choose it. I was just lucky enough, if you want to view it that way, to be born in the United States. And so most of our ascribed statuses are exactly that, things which are given to us by society. Through time, and this is the idea of the Hydra, through time, our various ascribed statuses can cause a source of marginalization. And so if there are two different groups, as we've learned with toxic othering, as if there's two different groups, there is a tendency for the group that has more power to use this power to marginalize the other group. This process of marginalization through toxic othering is an age-old process and has existed throughout human history and has woven itself into the cultures and traditions of every culture on the planet. We ourselves don't like to be victims of toxic othering. We don't like to be marginalized, but that is a fact of life. A sociologist attempts to understand the Hydra and understand these privileging forces and how they have led to toxic othering. So now that we understand the Hydra, we understand that privileging forces all center around toxic othering, how do we tame the Hydra? That's a huge question. First, we have to recognize that we can't defeat or kill the Hydra, because the Hydra represents part of human nature. It's part of human nature to see differences and to seek an advantage over others. I think that that's a natural tendency for one group to be suspicious of or even afraid of another group. And so I think the idea of seeing differences, seeing diversity, is natural. So that's part of human nature. So we can't kill the Hydra or defeat the Hydra. We need to understand the Hydra. We need to understand human nature and create norms and laws and policies and ways of living in the world that address toxic othering and reverse it back to normal othering. Normal othering, as we discussed earlier, is the idea that yes, there are differences, and that's something that we should cherish and we should respect. There are differences in cultures, differences in religions, differences in genders, differences in parts of the world, and so on. And so, yes, there are differences, but that normal othering cannot and should not remain able to transition into toxic othering, which it has done through history. And so taming the Hydra means understanding toxic othering and finding ways both at the local level and at the regional level, the national level, the global level, the organizational level. Toxic othering can be addressed on all of these levels by being sensitive to what differences are and sensitive to situation where differences are turned into one group being superior to the other. And so this is a huge task to accomplish. It means looking back at our history, looking back at our culture, looking back at global cultures, like a good sociologist, looking back through time and looking all around the world and recognizing that toxic othering has created marginalized populations all around the world. So taming the Hydra means confronting this toxic othering, but it can't be done all at once, and it can't be done in an insensitive or rapid way. It needs to be done carefully, thoughtfully, and with constant conversation with those who are marginalized. As we dive into the Hydra theory deeper and deeper, I want to share with you a quotation from a Spanish philosopher that I encountered early in my career. What I'm about to quote is something he wrote in one of his books back in the early 20th century. His name is Miguel de Unamuno, and here is the quotation from his book. He says, "My intent has been, is, and will continue to be that those who read my works shall think and meditate upon fundamental problems, and has never been to hand them completed thoughts. I have always sought to agitate and, even better, to stimulate rather than instruct. Neither do I sell bread, nor is it bread, but yeast or ferment. I ask you to read and reread that quotation and consider the Hydra. It is not something that is concretely real. It is an idea that is meant to stimulate thought. Here's another quotation from an African man named Mandami. He wrote this in a book called Saviors and Survivors, and I think it also speaks to the lesson I would like you to take from the Hydra. He said, quote, "In contrast to those who suggest that we act as soon as the whistle blows, I suggest that, even before the whistle blows, we ceaselessly try to know the world in which we live and act. Even if we must act on imperfect knowledge, we must never act as if knowing is no longer relevant." And so I'm offering those two quotations to have you think deeply about what those two authors are saying. One a Spaniard, the other from the continent of Africa. And I want you to think about what those comments mean and how they impact your understanding of the Hydra. The Hydra is not chiseled in stone, like I said. The Hydra is an idea. It's a way of knowing the world, a way of framing what we know about the world that I think stimulates questions, stimulates critique, and stimulates perhaps social change in a positive direction, bending the moral arc toward justice, taming the Hydra. A big challenge, I know. I'm very much looking forward to class tomorrow, and I wanted to do one last video to expand on the concept of the Hydra. I want to explain it as simply as I can. The Hydra is a visual tool, a comparison that looks at all of the different privileging forces that impact our lives, all of those negative social forces that impact our lives. And I'm pointing out with the Hydra that the body of the Hydra is all connected. All of the heads are connected to the same body, and that body is fueled by, is fed by this process of toxic othering. Toxic othering, as explained in your notes, is the idea that one group sees itself as different from another group, for example, males and females. When there's a sense of difference of power between the two groups, the differences turn into one being superior to the other. In more technical terms, differentiation turns into stratification. Simple differences are transferred into one being superior to the other. And so if we look at all of the different privileging forces like colonialism, racism, classism, sexism, and all the other privileging forces, they're all essentially the same thing. They all have essentially the same process behind them. They have the process of toxic othering behind them. One of the difficulties in understanding Hydra theory is that it makes us look at our culture and begin to question our culture. And that is always a very difficult and perhaps even dangerous thing to do. But as a sociologist, we are trained to look at the world objectively and see things not as we want to see them, but as they are. And so the sociologist puts away their values, puts away their biases, their cultural biases, when they try to observe something and describe something and analyze something. They try to what's called bracket out any of their views and opinions and see things as they are. And what that means is and this is difficult, what that means is that it demands that we look at our own culture as we would look at any other culture. We can't be ethnocentrically viewing our culture as different from and superior to another. We look at our culture as another culture. And so the Hydra theory is difficult in part because it demands to bracket out our sense of our own culture and look at things objectively and clearly. It's difficult to do.